Hi, in this next video, we'll talk about the enabling environment for risk management. So according to our previous lectures, we identified that the risk management process is supported by two enabling environments. One is risk governance and culture, and another is strategy and objective setting. Okay, so we'll now discuss those two enabling or supporting concepts to the whole risk management process. First, we'll talk about strategy and objective setting. So in terms of strategy and objective setting, it is important to risk management because in strategy and objective setting, we analyze the business context. And in so doing, in analyzing the business context, it helps in the risk identification process because part of the strategy development in an organization is to first determine internal and external advantages or strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats of an entity. And in so doing, we're able to identify potential sources of risk as we provide business context in strategy setting. Okay. Another concept that's relevant in terms of strategy and risk is the definition of the risk or determination of the risk appetite of an organization. No, whether it is explicit or implied in the strategy process, risk appetite is actually defined in the strategy and objective setting process of an organization. And lastly, how to consider risks and strategy in the formulation of business objectives. Okay, they are both intertwined. First, in considering risks in the analysis of business context, so internal and external environment of an organization are both studied in strategy setting, right? And as such, these strategy setting tools also provide insights into the risk identification and definition of the risk appetite of the organization. Okay, when you do a Porter's five forces analysis or PESEL analysis, you're actually looking at external attributes or external forces which influence business. Okay, and strategy influences business strategy. Some of those influences may be positive or negative, but in some, those influences lead to variations in outcome. Correct? It leads to variations in outcome. And as such, they are also sources of risk because any variation from the expected outcome is the risk that we want to mitigate. Okay? The effect that business context has on an entity's risk profile may be viewed in three stages because in terms of past, present, and future performance. When you look back at the past performance, it can give the organization information in shaping its risk profiles, identifying its risk. Okay. Looking at current performance can show how current trends, relationships, and other factors affect risk profile. And with these information at hand, it will enable you to look into the future and try to predict the impact of these factors to strategy. And with that, these factors have an impact on strategy. And those impact can be the source of risk. And therefore, you want to analyze the risk appetite of a business. Okay. When we talk about risk appetite, we define it as the amount of risk on a broad level an organization is willing to accept. Willing to accept. Okay. So conceptually, it's easy to understand, right? Kasi parang risk appetite is simply how much risk can we take in, can we hold in our portfolio. Okay. The risk appetite might be large or small, but actually quantifying risk appetite is very difficult. What exactly do we mean when we say that we're willing to take in a lot of risk if we are risk aggressive? Okay. How much risk do we really mean when we say we are risk averse? Okay? Madali siyang i-express in a qualitative sense, but not really very very easy to express in a quantified sense. No, so that's why again, risk appetite is a qualitative and quantitative uh, approach. Okay, many organizations develop strategy and risk appetite in parallel. Okay, kasi when you define strategy, you tend to exclude other strategies, right? And yung method mo of exclusion might give you a clue of what your risk appetite is. For example, I am a company um, manufacturing chips, right? My strategy is to expand overseas. But I said expand in Asia only, right? Implied that my risk appetite is investments in Asia, right? Because I have already excluded other kinds of expansion investments, like expansion in the Middle East or expansion in the US or expansion in Africa. So in effect, when I was able to define my strategy, my exclusion of certain actions or certain implementation, no, already gives me an idea of the risk appetite that you have in the organization. Okay. So that's why usually it's just so embedded into the strategy process that actually you're already defining your risk appetite, you know, with in a strategy development process. Some entities consider risk appetite in qualitative terms, while others in quantitative terms. So when you quantify it, you want to balance growth, return, and risk. Okay. So the best approach for an entity is one that aligns with the analysis used to assess risk in general, whether that is qualitative or quantitative. So usually, the risk appetite that can be defined several ways. That's why that similar to how you define risk severity in various ways. Some are quantitative and some are qualitative. Okay, so the risk appetite is how much risk in total can you actually tolerate, right? Because for each of the risk items that we discussed in the previous video, there's a severity there. It could be an amount or it can be an action or an outcome. Okay. So in the how much in aggregate can you really take in? Okay. So essentially that's what risk appetite is. So there is no standard or right risk appetites that applies to all entities. Kasi it depends on number one, the size of the entity. No, if you're a small company, probably mas konting risk ang kaya mong take in. If you're a big entity, probably you can take in a lot of risks. Okay? It depends also in the industry. No, in a company that is or in an industry where growth is the name of the game, then probably you need to take in more risks to stay afloat in your industry. But if you're in a very stable industry, then probably the risk appetite is also low since you want to maintain that stability. So there's no single risk appetite. And sometimes it depends on management. No, I mean the individual makeup or individual risk appetite of the members of management. Kung matatapang yung management mo, baka mataas ang risk appetite nila. Right? So really, it varies from organization to organization and it also varies depending on the situation. In a boom year or when economic growth is so high, risk appetite might be huge. In a bust year or a pandemic like what we are experiencing now, then probably risk appetites are low. And so therefore, mag-change rin because of the economic activity. Some entities will develop a series of cascading expressions of risk appetite, referencing targets, ranges, ceilings, and floors. So we'll discuss that in the next slide. So sometimes you can express your risk appetite in terms of a target. For example, in terms of a target, for example, a credit union, they express their risk appetite as a loan loss target of 0.5% of the loan portfolio. No? So which means they were able to quantify it. Whatever our different decisions are or strategy will be, okay, our actions should be within the loan loss target of 0.5%. Anything above that is outside of our risk appetite. And so we should not pursue those loans if it is above our risk appetite of 0.5% of loan portfolio. Okay? So that's one way to express risk appetite. Another way to express risk appetite is in terms of a range. Of course, a reasonable range. No? So for example, in the same credit union, for example, no, is loans of between 0 to a maximum of 5 billion pesos. Beyond that is outside of our risk appetite kasi there will be a lot of concentration risk. Lalami masyadong exposure natin in a certain lender, in a certain borrower. So there was a range that was provided. In this example, a medical supply company operates within a low overall risk range. However, pinaka-strict siya sa safety and compliance. So basta safety and compliance issue, our range for risk-taking is low. It can be marginally higher for strategic, reporting, and operations objectives, but for specific items, it is very low tolerance for risk or very low risk appetite. So that's also one way of expressing it. In this way, we know that there are differences in the kind of risk that you are willing to take or the level of risk a company is willing to take depending on the objective or strategy or the goal that is being affected. Next is a ceiling. Okay, so for example, a university accepts a moderate risk appetite as it expands the scope of its offerings. Okay, but the university will not accept programs that present severe risk to the university's mission vision, forming a ceiling on acceptable decisions. So they can expand their programs as long as it is within the mission vision of the organization. So that's a qualitative risk exposure wording, right? Anything outside our mission and vision is outside of our risk appetite. Next is a floor. So for example here, a technology company has aggressive goals for growth in its sector and recognizes that such growth requires significant capital investment and they have a floor. Anything below 25% of the operating budget for investment in technology is not acceptable. Kasi pag below 25% of investment natin, there's a higher risk that our IT systems are not going to keep up with our aggressive expansion goals. So therefore, that floor also serves as our expression for our risk appetite. Okay. So an organization may consider various parameters to help frame its risk appetite. Number one, strategic parameters. I sort of alluded to this. So for example, for new products to pursue or avoid. When I excluded, yung example ko kanina sa chip company, right? When I excluded countries outside of Asia, that's a risk management, risk appetite expression. My risk is only up to or within Asia. Okay? Investment for capital expenditures and merger and acquisition activities, where to pursue and where to avoid. So those are strategic parameters. Okay? For example, don't go in a country where the political risk is high. Right? So that is an expression of my risk appetite in strategic terms. Financial terms. So if you have a maximum acceptable variation in performance, just like the example in the loan loss provisions, so those are financial parameters. And also operating parameters, so environmental requirements, safety targets, quality targets, customer concentrations are all operating parameters. Okay, so essentially the risk appetite boxes where you can move, right? No, kasi when you set out the strategy, you defined what you want to do, no, and corollary to that, you have also defined where you don't want to go and what you don't want to do. So you just need to make sure that it is known within the organization. This is our strategy. This is not this is our strategy, and based on our strategy, these are the things that we should not be doing, okay? Because it's outside of the strategy under contemplation anymore, okay? So therefore, through this, there's an alignment of strategy and risk appetite, okay? So the strategy should be consistent with the risk appetite. Okay, so for example, a sports equipment manufacturer had this strategy to grow business by expanding global manufacturing operations. But later on, na-realize niya, ay, hindi pala lahat ng bansa, okay, will have the same infrastructure requirements as what I feel is viable. And for example, there are government rules and regulations where I don't want to mess up with. No, I mean, kasama ba North Korea dyan sa global manufacturing locations when it's difficult to even get in and to invest? So therefore, you have to recalibrate strategy to make sure that it is precise and within the understanding of all people in the organization. So in this case, that strategy was rewarded to grow business by expanding to global locations with established infrastructure requirements and governmental regulations. So there it was able to box, and it was an expression of the risk appetite. No, kasi nasabi natin kung ano yung dapat huwag i-pursue. Okay? So aside from defining the risk appetite, no, it will connect to business objectives and define the risk tolerance of an organization. In the strategy statement, meron din siyang risk appetite statement, right? Kung ano yung dapat wag gawin on a strategic basis. Now, strategy, of course, you know that strategy links to the objectives of an organization. So yung goals of an organization are defined from strategy. So from the risk appetite, which is the strategic expression of the risk that you're willing to take, no? Ang katapat naman yan, risk tolerance. Okay? So for example, for us to be able to achieve our strategic objectives, we need an ROI of 5% on our portfolio. That was the target aligned with strategy. Okay? Now, given that this is our target, our allowable tolerance is 3 to 7%. And this is aligned with our risk appetite. Okay? This range is the risk that I'm willing to tolerate. So my residual risk should be within 3 to 7%. Okay? So that's a tolerable risk for me. Okay? That doesn't mean there is no risk action plans kasi pwede mo pa siyang inarrow para ma-achieve mo yung target na 5%. It just means it's already tolerable. So if you have a risk event that will produce an annual return of 0%, that's outside of my risk appetite, right? And so therefore, you should have a risk action plan so that you can bring in within your risk tolerance, right? And of course, the closer it is to 5%, then the better, because I'm closer into the achievement of the target, okay? If I cannot reduce, if I cannot go within 3 to 7% regardless of the risk action plan, then I should probably avoid that risk, right? Whatever that risk is, I should probably avoid it kasi it results to an outcome that is beyond my risk appetite. Okay? So for example, here in the second example, the objective is target delivery within 40 minutes. The risk is traffic, heavy traffic. Okay? And because of that, you will be outside of the tolerable, the tolerance. No? Say magiging 1 hour ang mga deliveries mo because of traffic. So what you do? So you have to form a risk action plan so that you can bring it within the allowable delivery time in your risk tolerance and at the same time target 40 minutes, which is your performance target. Okay? So, yun yung alignment ng risk appetite and tolerance, strategy and target. And of course, strategy and appetite should also go hand in hand. Okay? So that's the importance of strategy and objectives in risk management. Next, we go to risk governance and culture. We already discussed a little bit of governance in our first video, but we'll try to explore it again in this video. So when we talk about risk governance and culture, we are actually talking about or trying to explore issues in board risk oversight and operating structure. Okay? How are you organized in the organization? And lastly, risk culture. No, dapat may kultura ng risk acceptance and honesty about risk in the organization. Okay? And those are enabling environments that will make risk management a more effective process. So in terms of board risk oversight, we need to understand that accountability, is important in risk management. So there should be a culture of accountability. Otherwise, risk management is not useful, no? Because if there's no accountability to the materialization of those risks. Okay? In terms of oversight, the ultimate accountability on risk oversight is the board of directors. So dapat nakabantay ang board. Okay? However, it is management which is actually implementing the day-to-day responsibilities of risk management. So board has a primary responsibility and oversight, but management are the risk owners themselves. Okay? Because remember, they serve at the pleasure of the board. No? So board has oversight, ang may responsibility over risk is actually management. Okay? Another issue with respect to board risk oversight is skills, experience, and knowledge. Basically, the board must be composed of people who have the skills, experience, and knowledge to assess the risk of the organization. So therefore, they must have the necessary skills, experience, and knowledge in risk management. And the business itself. So for example, entities exposed to cyber risk may need to have board members who have expertise in IT or access to the required expertise on IT so that they can provide effective oversight on risk management activities. Okay? Otherwise, failure. There will be a failure in oversight. Okay? Next is independence. For board risk oversight to be effective, the board should be independent because it enhances their objectivity in identifying and evaluating risk management programs. Okay? Without independence, then there might be undue influence by management, and will not be able. Therefore, the board will not be able to do its fiduciary duty of protecting the shareholders. Okay. Another issue with respect to risk culture is the establishment of operating structures. Obviously, the board cannot implement day-to-day activities with respect to risk management. So it is the management who has the responsibility to define the roles, responsibilities, and accountabilities of individuals with respect to the business and the risks that these businesses entail. Okay. So what's important to realize, which I already discussed in the previous video, the ERM department is not the risk owner. No? They are facilitators of the ERM process. Okay? So they are not accountable for the risk itself. They're accountable to the process, making sure that the process happens, making sure that the process is effective, making sure that there's monitoring and proper quantification of the risk severity. No? But the risks itself, management or whoever management assigns as the accountable person is the risk owner and accountable for the risk. Okay, so that's why dapat pag naglista ka ng risk, nasa risk register, nasa risk action plans, at the end of the risk action plans, meron kang listahan of who is the risk owner for those specific risks. so that you know who is accountable. And by identifying who the risk owner is, you're also able to identify kaninong performance should be affected if the risk action plans do not materialize. Okay? So clearly defining authority is important as it empowers people to act as needed in a given role, but also puts limits on authority. Okay? In designing that governance structure, there's also a risk of putting too much authority down the line. No? So dapat meron ding limits on authority. No? Kasi the bigger the risk, it should be parang higher people in the organization should be more accountable. Okay, so that's why a risk-based decision no, is enhanced when management delegates responsibility only to the extent required. Okay? Kasi kung high ang risk severity, then no, it should be approved by higher levels in the organization. Okay? So it specifies transactions requiring review and approval. Again, accountability and making sure it goes up within the organization if needed. And risk-based decisions considers new and emerging risks as part of the decision making. Now, risk culture basically talks about risk awareness and whether risk management is an acceptable concept in an organization. So the objective of promoting risk awareness is to ensure that everyone within a business is proactively identifying key risks, seriously thinking about the consequences of those risks, and communicating up and down the organization those risks that warrant attention. Okay? Usually in our organization, merong proactively na nag-iisip ng risk. Okay? But sometimes they do not think about the consequence, or sometimes they don't feel the psychological safety to communicate them up and down the organization. Right? Sometimes it's difficult to flag risks kasi sasabihin sa'yo, nega ka. Right? Or sasabihin sa'yo, kontra ka naman sa mga plans ng department ko kasi highlight ka ng highlight ng risk. So hindi ma-approve yung project ko. Right? So there's always that I guess mahirap siyang i-communicate, no? So in a risk-aware environment, most risk management issues should be addressed before they become bigger problems, and communication is the key. Making sure that everyone is aware, everyone knows what risk management is, and everyone knows that they have the psychological safety of being able to communicate that across the organization, whether upwards or downwards. Okay? So there are many organizational processes which promote risk awareness within a company, and some of them are the following. Number one is to set the tone from the top. Very important. Okay? Kasi if senior management, in particular the CEO, is serious about risk management, then everyone will be empowered to be serious also in risk management. Okay? If the CEO is not so averse to criticism, for example, and the CEO identifies risks also, then yung mga tao within the company will have the same strength of conviction in terms of communicating risks across the organization. It's only but natural that it's difficult to discuss risks because we're talking about potential failures of people, right? Or potential things that are expected to happen, or potential negative things that may happen. And so therefore, mahirap pag-usapan ng risk. No? So it requires the tone from the top for us to have a candid, open discussion on what could go wrong. No? So the authority of the CEO, senior management, is important to set the tone that all are welcome to join that discussion on risk management. So that's why setting the tone from the top is a very critical way to promote risk culture in an organization. Second is to establish a risk taxonomy. Okay. So again, as I mentioned in previous slides, risk taxonomy is the dictionary of risk, right? If we have a risk taxonomy, then there will be no miscommunication in terms of the risks that was identified in different companies and different departments within a company. And because there will be no miscommunication or limited miscommunication, there will be better understanding and openness in terms of the risks that are being discussed in an organization. Okay. So they will now have a common language for risk. And therefore, that also binds them together, right? And make sure that everyone is on the same page. Provide risk training and development. Of course, you need to equip employees with skills so that they can identify and manage risks they are responsible for. So therefore, training is very significant and important part of the promotion of a risk culture. And lastly, is to link risk and compensation. Of course, people matter if there if there are financial, people will pay attention if there are financial incentives related to risk action plans. Okay, so if risk action plans, the implementation of risk action plans is part of their job or part of their key performance indicators as employees, and therefore it contributes towards uh, good appraisal of performance, which leads to financial incentives or bonuses, then definitely they'll be going to work to ensure that risk management will be implemented in the organization. So linking risk to performance and performance to compensation will definitely improve the risk culture. That's it. So those are the two main enabling activities for risk management. Thank you.